Let's go to Abigail Bimman in Ottawa. And Abigail, we heard some of the numbers. 240,000 people have already applied. That number will dramatically rise really in the coming hours and the coming days. And also, he touched on more of the CERB, and we will learn more. Maybe you can touch on that. And you referred to the people who don't yet qualify. That's the key word, yet, indicating that that will change. What did we hear about that?
Right, that was really the most significant piece of news coming out of the Prime Minister's address this morning. As we spoke about before we heard from Justin Trudeau, there's been a lot of concern from people ineligible to apply for the CERB the way that it currently stands now. And the Prime Minister addressed three separate areas here. The big one, or the first one that he mentioned, I should say, is anyone working 10 hours a week or less. They are looking at how those people will be eligible for the CERB in future. That's a big concern for people in the gig economy, for example, or working freelance. They might be able to secure some work, but certainly their income has been drastically reduced. And right now, if you are working at all, you're not eligible for that $500 a week. So that was a big new promise coming from the Prime Minister, but no details yet. Still a wait and see with how that will apply. He also spoke about changes for post-secondary students. We talked about how they first thought they would be eligible for the CERB. Now, currently, they are ineligible for the CERB. And Justin Trudeau also spoke about workers who are working, but not necessarily making as much as that $500 a week benefit could provide them. He specifically referenced healthcare workers working to help seniors, but not hitting that $500 a week top benefit. So the Prime Minister is promising to make some changes to the plan so that those people can get help, and that was a significant number. And going back to what you pointed out about Justin Trudeau saying 240,000 people have applied, worth noting, as I believe you did too, that the program just opened this morning, but also that today, on day one of the program, only Canadians who were born in January, February, or March are eligible to apply. So when you think about how quickly that number will go up, tomorrow, the next 3 months of the calendar year will be eligible.
Well, all this giving hope to a lot of people, because there are so many people in this country who have their hand up and their hand out, because the lineup is, of course, growing with so many people in need. And, you know, the other side, there's the CERB, and then there's the wage subsidy. He talked about the, bringing back Parliament in some respect, the virtual Parliament. Any changes, any developments on that front? Anything that we could glean from what he said, and in terms of any changes to the legislation at all?
Right. So I think important to note that Trudeau said that in the coming days, a reduced Parliament would come back to pass that new legislation. So we saw over the weekend, the government House leader put out a letter that he issued to the Speaker of the House looking for ways to talk about a virtual Parliament. And that's something that Justin Trudeau said is very important going forward, especially for MPs who are far from Ottawa. And it's just not feasible to get here for an in-person Parliament, even in reduced numbers, respecting physical distancing. But the way that he was speaking suggested that for the legislation to pass, for the changes to the funding to pass, that would still be this plan that they had before of a reduced in-person Parliament. He seemed to be speaking more about in the future in general, looking at making a virtual Parliament happen. And just to recap, talking about that wage subsidy, when the Prime Minister changed the plan from a 10% wage subsidy to a 75% wage subsidy, that is talking about a lot more money than the original $107 billion economic plan that was on the table. And the Prime Minister said last week that he wants to recall Parliament so as to pass new legislation that will hand out more money through the significantly larger 75% wage subsidy.
Yeah, he's under a lot of pressure from the opposition parties to make sure this is a collective effort, especially in a minority parliament. Abigail, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. Abigail Bimman from Ottawa. Let's stay in Ottawa and bring in our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson. And the other big issue, he was talking about the PPE and the stopping of the shipment at the U.S.-Canada border. Talk about that, Mercedes. And really, the Prime Minister is relying on diplomacy and negotiations to get them through this political, fiasco. Fair to say?
Yeah, so he's obviously hoping to be able to work this out by talking behind the scenes. Battling Donald Trump in public doesn't tend to go well. If past examples, particularly with the Canadian and U.S. government, are informative as to what to expect. So they're hoping that they can chat behind the scenes to explain that it is in fact in the U.S. national interests as well as Canadian national interests that neither side restrict the flow of essential personnel or restrict the flow of masks going across the border, because what affects one country very much affects the other, not only in terms of health, but the economy, socially, in all kinds of different ways. We don't know exactly which masks Doug Ford is making reference to. I spoke with a senior government official, and they say they're not aware of any federal shipments that have been intercepted or stopped. Doug Ford is saying that a shipment for Ontario was. We're trying to get to the bottom of what's going on there, of where the shipment was coming from, of who stopped it, of why it was stopped. Those are questions we don't have answers to yet, but I expect that this is going to be a question that comes up very shortly when the Deputy Prime Minister sits down and gives her daily briefing along with the ministers there, and of course for Premier Ford himself, who will be having a press conference this afternoon as well, as we try to figure out where. Federal government told me they are not aware this has happened to any federal shipments or any shipments at all at this point. So we're still trying to really figure out what is going on there. But obviously, with the kind of shortage of masks and equipment we're talking about, and with the Premier saying that Ontario could run out within a week, every mask counts.
And we're also hearing about the mobilization of the Canadian Armed Forces. We heard that last week in Quebec and now in Ontario. What's the latest on that front?
So at this point, there's only been one provincial request, and that request has come from Quebec, and it's only up in northern Quebec to help with processing people who are lining up for testing or treatment for COVID-19 in communities up there. But what we are hearing, and folks around Toronto are going to see this today, you will see a large number of soldiers and military vehicles on the highway. They are going up to CFB Borden. They're going to be there so they can pre-position, and that means that then when a request comes in, they're good to go and they're able to respond much more quickly. That request does not come in a formal way yet, but remember, military planners are sitting in these provincial meetings on a daily basis. They are talking behind the scenes. So when that request comes for the military, if it comes, the military will already know that it's coming before the official request comes in and will be positioned to do so. So keep an eye on what those vehicles are going to be doing in coming days.
And we talked about the military, Mercedes, and I want to ask you about some of the repatriation efforts as well. A big issue, a number of flights over the weekend. We've seen dozens of flights over the past few weeks. What's the latest on that? It's fair to say that a lot of people, the Foreign Affairs Minister even acknowledged that there will be many people simply forced to stay where they are, aren't they?
Yeah, not everyone will be able to come home. And as it is, anybody who has symptoms can't get on a plane and come home because there's concerns about them infecting other people on the flight and here in Canada. So there are still flights going back and forth. They are still ferrying many Canadians home. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people that have been brought back at this point. So they are making a very strong effort, but they're warning, look, we simply can't get everyone out. And in countries where the airports are closed, it's a lot harder to do that. I mean, here in Canada, we've got more limits on travel, but the airports haven't shut down completely. That has been the case in some countries, which makes it very difficult to get people out. Canadians who are aboard the cruise liners in Florida, they're still trying to work on ways to try to bring them home. So certainly lots of challenges ahead still for the department, but some folks will have to hunker down where they are, and the government has said they will supply up to $5,000 for them to be able to pay off some of the costs of staying there when they weren't expecting to.
And a lot of checkpoints being set up within Canada. Talk about that if you can. We heard some of the border restrictions and the limits of travel within Quebec, but we're seeing it across the country play out in some respects.
This in and saying that they want to restrict travel between the provinces. I mean, here in Ottawa, it's a great example. A lot of people live on one side of the river and work on the other side between Ontario and Quebec, and you have to show ID to prove that you can go back and forth. So provinces really trying to crack down on that, especially provinces who don't have high infection rates right now, and they're concerned that people from other provinces with higher infection rates could come across and could spread COVID-19.
Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stevenson, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there.